Romans 12:2 talks about how we can be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And I've actually lived that experience, and I've watched other people that I've worked with go through that experience. It's this change from the inside out. I even heard one time that when we live with God's wisdom, it changes our biology, it changes our bodies. And people who are living outside of God's ways or outside of his wisdom, they experience a lot more depression, anxiety, and all kinds of other things. Don't need to go into that. I don't need to come to a conclusion either about where you're at or whether you're living aligned with God's ways or not. But I can say this, there is a biological change when you have a change in your thinking. And I've experienced this myself, and it was something that I kind of stumbled into as the Holy Spirit was leading me in coaching. But then I ended up discovering what was happening years later as I had been doing it already. So what's the biological change that can happen when you have an actual renewed mind? Well, we all have, and Dr. Caroline Leaf is actually a great resource for this if you want to get into it, but I'll give you the short version, the short story. We all have thoughts that are proteins. When these thoughts are brought to our prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain, they can actually then change shape. And when these thoughts or proteins change shape, they become new memories or new perspective on our past. Really simple. So you think about a time when you were 5 years old, you have a particular memory of that situation. It was a core memory. It doesn't come to mind until somebody asks you about it, or there's a trigger for it to happen. Now, that thought protein memory comes to the front of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. And as you recall it, it can have this one perspective, or you see it through this one lens. But here's what the Holy Spirit does. In the process of inviting God into that memory, and some people have walked through some of these things, maybe in inner healing or in theophostics is another term that people might understand what I'm talking about to put it into practice for themselves. But as that memory is recalled, and as you invite God into it and you ask the Holy Spirit, Lord, what do you see about this memory? What do you see about me in this memory? That thought changes shape because you get a new angle or perspective about that same situation. In other words, you didn't change the past, but your perception did change. And as that perception changes, for example, maybe God shows you that the other person who was abusing you emotionally or with their words, maybe they had something going on in their life and you wouldn't otherwise know it unless the Lord showed you through recalling that memory and through you asking him what he saw. You now start to have compassion for that person. Maybe it was a parent, maybe it was a sibling, and you start to see that memory from a new lens. Guess what happens? It's like a computer program that gets updated. And instead of going back to that core memory subconsciously now, because the memory goes back to, let's say, where it came from, instead of subconsciously going through life thinking that you're a victim and all these people who remind you of that person are out to get you and you just cast judgment, have negative thinking about them. Now you go through life going, wow, this person reminds me of that situation, that memory that I have a new perspective about, and I have a lot of compassion. And now, instead of having this real visceral kind of negative reaction in those situations, and I've seen this happen where people are in the workplace, somebody reminds them of their dad or of their mom. It's a boss, it's a coworker in another capacity, and they're now triggered. They don't understand why things aren't working, why there's this roadblock and barrier. And all of a sudden, as they gain a new perspective about that core memory that it's associated with, or that core person in that memory, they notice that their responses start to change. Their body doesn't have as much tension when they're interacting, that they can actually have a lot more confidence rather than insecurity when they're in conversation. Maybe they're even able to have a confrontational conversation that they weren't able to have before because of all of the emotional stuff that might have been hidden from that subconscious memory. This is the process of actually living from a renewed mind. And as you do this and as you go through that healing over time, it's a healing in your mind, you start to live from a different place. You start to understand, wow, I've gone through some hard stuff. I can't change the past, but God has actually changed my perspective about it. And now I see my present in a totally new light. I see the people in it from a totally new lens. And this shift in our mind changes how we behave. It changes how we talk. It changes how we think about making decisions in life. I've seen people who want to run from their job and completely do I never want to touch this again, to within just a few weeks, a total 180, like this is actually my calling. This is where I'm made to be. And it starts through this process of healing, renewing internally. So the biology of the change that's happening is real. It happens in our body, and it's not just something that happens at the soul level, the spirit level. This is something that happens in the physical realm, and God has such a specific way for helping us actually be changed and transformed. It's not something that we intellectually just talk about in theory or hear as a sermon and say, wow, that sounds really interesting. Like, I don't want to conform to the world. I want to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. You can. And it happens all the time.